Hello, welcome to KDO Studios, how to build a better garter tab and shawl with Laura Barker, or no Tears Garter Tab because there's no stitch pickup. Garter tabs have become a very popular way of starting shawls that begin at the neck and work out in different directions. And you can see why. It makes a nice consistent look with the garter tab all the way across. Before there were garter tabs, very often you would see shawls with kind of a missing V right here from where people started out. And the garter stitch started in both directions, but it kind of spread into a V in the middle. So with the garter tab, here's how it works. And I've left the tail on here from my cast on so you can see where I started. So you cast on generally about 3 stitches. I'm going to stick with 3 for now. And you work back and forth and create 1 garter ridge for every stitch you want to pick up. So very often that is 3 stitches. And so you work 6 rows to get your 3 garter bumps, and that puts you at your outside edge. And so you knit 1 more row. Then instead of flipping your work, you actually turn it 90 degrees and you pick up 3 stitches. These stitches, 1, 2, 3 stitches into the 3 garter bumps that you have. That part's not so bad, but then you turn another 90 degrees, and when you turn that 90 degrees, you have to pick up 3 stitches into your cast on edge, which is a little tight at that point, having turned 90 degrees twice, and a little bit hard to see. Now, the front looks pretty nice, not completely consistent, but very nice. On the back, you can see the bump where you picked up stitches, and I'm reasonably good at picking up stitches, but you can kind of see some bumps. Now, if anybody's looking this closely, tell them to back up, but for you and for your enjoyment, you might not want to have this bump here. And so let's look at how we can build a better garter tab without picking up these stitches. So you've probably seen this one coming, but when you want to start at one point and work out in 2 different directions, you need a provisional cast on. Until 2006, that caused fear in the hearts of many knitters. But when Judy Becker created her magic cast on and published it in Knitty.com in spring of 2006, tears over a provisional cast on became a thing of the past. So let's look at how we do that. There are many good videos available for this cast on in addition to the tutorial for free in Knitty.com, so I'm just going to go over it quickly. But basically you put your yarn slingshot fashion as you would for a long tail cast on, except the tail comes over your index finger and the working yarn actually comes over your thumb. To start, I just slide the yarn over my top needle. Now some people put an extra twist in there, but I haven't found that that's necessary. And the really important thing to remember about Judy's is that the stitches on the bottom needle are always created with the index finger, and the stitches on the top needle are always created with the thumb. So you're going back and forth and back and forth. So I have a stitch on the top needle, and so it's time to have one on the bottom needle. So I use the yarn from my index finger and I loop around. And then now it's time for one on the top needle. I use my thumb between and around. Once again, index finger around, thumb between and around, and then index finger. And that is 6 stitches. So that's not too many tears there, I don't think. And then I also want to point out, if you were to knit socks, you would be turning around like this to start your socks. But for the garter tab, you actually want to see the purl bumps. Don't you wish it could be true when you were knitting socks? But you want to see the purl bumps. So start with the needles pointing to the left, rotate them up towards the ceiling, and then over to the right. And you can see I'm holding on to my 2 yarns to make sure they don't go away. And now you can actually see the purl bumps. There are purl bumps right here on the back of this knitting. Now I have my needles reoriented, but before I do anything with them, I want to make sure that my tail is pulling off to the left and my working yarn is coming down in the front. And then I change this into my left hand. I still kind of hold on to my yarn, a little paranoid about losing my stitches, and I pull the bottom needle out so that these 3 bottom stitches are now on the cable, and they're just going to wait there until we need them. Now, at this point, you could just work a standard garter tab. You could knit your 6 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which would put you at your outside edge. You would work 1 more row, and you'd pick up the stitches into each one of your garter tab bumps, which is not too difficult, as I mentioned, but then you wouldn't need to, when you turn, pick up stitches from your cast on, because there the stitches are already there. So you just knit them. But we're trying to eliminate picking up stitches altogether. Before we complete our garter tab, I want to talk to you a little bit about your selvage stitch, your last stitch out on the end of your shawl. Now, many garter tabs specify knit 3 on each side, and you get a little bit of a bump going along the edge here, and that's very attractive. But I want to give you another option at the selvage, and that is to slip the first stitch purlwise and then knit 2, or however many are left. What that accomplishes is it gives you a nice chained edge across the top of your shawl, which very closely matches a standard bind off. This edge is less stretchy, so don't use it if you're worried about the width of your shawl. We will have some help keeping this straight when we are slipping on one side and adding stitches on the other, because this tail where I cast on will always be at the outside edge. Unfortunately, that is non-negotiable. If you want to be able to knit out in 2 different directions, you want to be looking at purl bumps in 2 different directions, and that means an odd number of rows. And in order to get an odd number of rows, your tail's going to be out on your selvage edge, but we'll talk about how to sew that in later. We are ready to start building our Better Garter tab without picking up stitches and with a slip stitch selvage. Before we do that, when you're ready to work, first notice that if you had your tail to the left and your working yarn coming down, as I said, you can now see that this bottom stitch on the cable is trapped very nicely. It's not going anywhere. So to work this, on row 1 and right side rows, we're going to slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, knit 2, or the remainder of the garter border. And then on row 2, we're going to work a purl front and back increase and then knit the rest of the border. Now, why do we do a purl front and knit back? This is a wrong side row. We're creating a body stitch, and this body stitch is going to be a knit on the right side, so we want to create it as a purl on the wrong side. It's a little picky, but it makes a really pretty effect. So let's do that. Slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, snug it up since it's the first stitch, and then knit 2. And then we're going to turn. On the wrong side, I'm going to purl into the front. Now this is going to want to stretch out a little bit because of the angles of the needles, so snug this up a little bit. I've pulled my yarn to the back now, and then I'm knitting into the back loop, and then I'm just knitting back across this row. After I've turned my work, I'm on the outside edge, and you can see this because your yarn tail is here, and so you're going to slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, move the yarn to the back, knit 2. We do not want to knit the body stitch that we just created. We just want to turn and make our next increase. So after we've turned, we make our next increase, purl into the front, move the yarn to the back, snug everything up a little bit, and then knit through the back loop and knit 2. Once we've turned, we're back to a row 1, and so we're slipping 1 purlwise with yarn in front, knitting 2. And once again, we're on row 2, so we're going to purl into the front, take the yarn back, snug it up a little bit, knit into the back, and knit across. Now, if you're counting, we've worked rows 1 and 2 3 times, and so we have worked 6 rows, but let's look at what we have. We don't actually have to count because we're basically creating our stitches as we work. And so once you have the right number of stitches created, you are done. You don't have to count rows. So we have our 3 garter stitch, our 3 body stitch, and then down here on the bottom, we have our 3. And once again, we're on row 2, so we're going to purl into the front, take the yarn back, snug it up a little bit, knit into the back, and knit across. Now, if you're counting, we've worked rows 1 and 2 3 times, and so we have worked 6 rows, but let's look at what we have. We don't actually have to count because we're basically creating our stitches as we work. And so once you have the right number of stitches created, you are done. You don't have to count rows. So we have our 3 garter stitch, our 3 body stitch, and then down here on the bottom, we have our 3 provisional cast on. We are also starting to create a very nice chained selvage, our slip stitch edge. And now that we have all of the stitches we need, we simply pull the needle through the stitches that you just worked, slide them all onto the cable, and there are your 9 stitches. So we have only worked 6 rows, but we are ready to go. If you were doing a standard garter tab, you would be working 1 more row, row 7, to pick up the stitches, and then you would be working row 8 to get you back to the start. But you will see when this is done that actually eliminating those 2 rows makes the garter across the tab spread out more nicely. Another benefit to this is that we haven't worked an extra row across the body stitches either, and so that helps combat the tendency that sometimes the garter stitch has to want to push up and make a little hump in the middle. The only downside to this is by not working row 8 as a setup row, we didn't put our stitch markers in. If you have removable stitch markers, you could just pin them on, but if you don't have removable markers, just work the setup row by slipping stitches. And so we want to slip purlwise, we don't want to change the direction, and so it would likely say knit 3. We're going to slip 3, place a marker. I'm not working these stitches, I'm just slipping them. So slip 1, place a marker, slip 1, place a marker, slip 1, place a marker, and then we're going to slip these 3. Now you've got your markers on. It's a lot of markers. They'll spread out quickly. Because we are working on a circular needle, we don't actually even have to slip those back. We can just pull our cable through to get it back to the beginning and ready to go. At this point, your setup is ready to go and you could start working any garter tab shawl from this point. So I'm going to just work a basic stockinette shawl with yarn over increases at the garter edges and in the middle by the spine. On right sides, you're going to work your border. And you want to be consistent. So if you were knitting, you should knit. If you've been slipping, you should keep slipping. You're going to slip the first marker. You're going to yarn over, knit to the next marker, yarn over. That's your first little triangle. Then you're going to slip the marker and you're going to knit 1, or if you had a wider spine, you'll knit those stitches and slip the marker on the other side of the spine, and then you'll work a yarn over, knit to the next marker and yarn over for your other triangle, slip the final marker, and then complete your border. On row 2, Again, I'm slipping, so slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, knit 2. You slip the marker, and then you're going to purl all, and that you're going to be slipping a couple of more markers as you purl. When you get to the final marker, don't forget to switch back to knits after all that work of setting up your garter tab. And you can repeat rows 1 and 2 until you're ready to bind off. And of course, if you wanted to work a garter stitch shawl, everywhere it says purl, you would just knit. So working my shawl, working row 1, I'm going to slip a stitch. I'm going to knit 2. I'm going to slip a marker. I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to knit to the next marker, which is 1 whole stitch. I'm going to work another yarn over. I'm going to slip the marker. That's 1 triangle. I'm going to knit my spine stitch, slip this marker, and now my next triangle is again yarn over, knit to the next marker. Oh look, it's already there. It should always be symmetrical to the first one. I'm going to yarn over, I'm going to slip my marker, and then I'm going to knit 3. Now, that one is into your tail, so you're going to want to tighten that up a little bit. For row 2, I'm going to work my garter border. I'm going to slip the first stitch marker. I'm going to purl almost all the way across. I'm slipping the middle 2 stitch markers. Now, when you're purling, this last will be a yarn over, so that'll help. You always want to pay attention when you get to the yarn overs. That's kind of like the signpost on the map. Slip the last stitch and work your border. Now, if I slide these stitches onto the center cable, I can see a little better what I'm creating right here. My garter tab is going straight across. I have my 3 border stitches. My little triangle is 3 stitches now, and of course on the next row I'll add 2 more yarn overs, making it 5. The spine is going to stay the same size, symmetrically 3 stitches in this triangle, and then 3 more garter stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and work that about 4 more times and bind off so we can take a much better look at it. Comparing the standard shawl to the one I've just done, there are a couple of things you can notice. First of all, you can kind of see that there's the bump here and it's not quite as uniform, whereas here working across it's much more uniform. We also, right here you have these 3 stitches that are kind of sticking out and don't quite go in line with the increases, whereas here by working this as an increase, those are pretty much gone. And then we have this slip stitch border, which you can see that's just a matter of preference. You can have them with the bumps, you can have them with the chain slip stitch, it's up to you. Now, because we trapped this yarn when we were first working and didn't want to lose stitches, it is pulled a little bit to the front. And you can see where you can see a difference because some of the chains go this way and some of the chains go that way. That's unavoidable, but we can take care of this little bump. If you look back at this stitch, you can see where that yarn is, and just go ahead and pull that yarn up, releasing that bump. So you can see that the garter here is truly very uniform. However you weave in ends is fine. I use a needle, so I have threaded my tail here. And so what I want to do, I have my chains going in one direction, I have my chains going in the other direction. I want to find the first chain going in the opposite direction, and I want to just put my needle through that chain and out the back. And then I'm going to sew that in, and you can see now it looks almost like a figure 8, joining the 2 chains in the middle, and then I can weave in that end on the back. Now I have one more level of crazy for anybody who wants to try it. This is really going off the deep end, even for me. But if you look, this stitch still interrupts the patterns of the eyelets, and so on both triangles. And so what if we got rid of those 2 side stitches? What if we only cast on our spine? Then when we started working, you can see that we would actually get these holes completely making a T for, I think, the prettiest you can do. Again, this is really going off the deep end, but in the next example you'll see a better reason for why you might want to do this. I am going to call this the spine only garter tab, and it is set up just like the shawl we worked before. I have used Judy's to cast on my 3 stitches in each direction. I've got my tail trapped and I'm ready to work my first row. So I'm still going to slip 1, knit 1, knit 2. That's row 1, just like before. And I'm going to work row 2 just like before as well. So I'm going to purl and knit into this first stitch, and then I'm going to knit 2, and I've added only 1 stitch, and that's all I want to add. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my cable through the stitches so they're all on the same needle, and you can see it's even smaller than before. I only have 7 stitches. Now at this point you kind of have to trust what you're doing, because you really can't see anything with this all scrunched up like this. But we don't have garter tab pattern that starts with 7 stitches total. We want 9 stitches total. And so what we're going to do on row 3, we're going to work a yarn over on each side of the spine, and that's going to provide the 2 yarn overs that work into the corners of our shawl. So I'm still doing my slip stitch selvage. So I slip 1, be careful, they're really close together, knit 2, that's my garter stitch border, my first border. So I'm going to yarn over, I'm going to knit my spine, I'm going to yarn over, and then I'm going to knit the other garter border. And so we're going to need 1 more row to complete our setup. So I'm going to slip, knit 2, I'm going to place a marker, and then I'm going to purl 1. I'm purling 1 into that yarn over, and that is the first stitch of one of the corners. I'm going to place another marker. I'm going to purl the spine. I'm going to place another marker, and I'm going to purl the yarn over. That's the start of my second triangle. And then I'm going to put 1 more marker, and I'm going to knit the last 3. And now I do have 9 stitches, and I have all those stitch markers all stacked up, and you're looking just like you looked before. And now that we have our 9 stitches, we are ready to go back to our plain stockinette shawl pattern. So I'll go ahead and complete the turquoise shawl so we can compare the two. Comparing the 2 shawls, the big difference is with our original shawl, we have the holes here, and then this triangle comes off of this 1 stitch, and this triangle comes off of this 1 stitch. In the turquoise version, this is the start of the triangle. This yarn over is the start of the triangle, and then we get to the point of having the 1 stitch, and so again you get a perfect T of yarn overs. But now let's look at a different application. This is a crescent shaped shawl, And it also begins from the same little garter tab that we've been using before, but with the crescent shaped shawl, you don't work increases in the middle. You actually work one yarn over on each side on the wrong side, and then on the right side, you do a double increase into each one of those yarn overs, which is why you get these very large holes. So I think you can see how getting down to just one stitch in the middle here would actually make this shawl look much more uniform. So the crescent shawl starts exactly the same with Judy's and my 3 stitches on each side, but there is a slight difference. Because of the way the increases work, we're actually beginning on a wrong side row. So row 1 is wrong side this time. That doesn't change how you work this row. Since I am on a right side row now, row 2 is a right side row, I'm going to work my increase so that my first stitch is a knit stitch. And so I'm going to do just a standard knit, give it a little tug, knit into the back, and then knit 2. And now you are ready. You've made your one increase. You're ready to slide all your stitches onto the cable. So now for row 3, which is my setup row, and I am back to a wrong side row. I am slipping 1 purlwise with yarn in front, because that's my selvage, and knitting 2. Now I want to place my marker. I want to work a yarn over, and now the spine stitch, we're on the wrong side. I want to purl, but I also want to give it a little twist, and we'll talk about why in the middle. So I want to purl 1 through the back loop. So a little bit like kissing your elbow. Bring your yarn to the front, bring your needle in through the back of this loop, and purl. Purl through the back loop, and then I'm going to need another yarn over, and then I'm going to need a stitch marker, and then I'm going to knit 3. And again, that last stitch is coming into the stitch with the tail, so give that a little yank. And so now it's starting to look perhaps a slight bit more like something, and your setup is complete. So now I'm just going to work the most basic crescent shawl. And so row 4, which is a right side row, I work my border, slip my marker, and then into this yarn over. Crescent shawls, most of them use a special increase. Into the yarn over, I knit, yarn over, and knit all into 1 stitch. So I've just increased 2 stitches. And then I knit to the other side, and I stop 1 stitch before the marker, and that's going to be another yarn over. And so I am going to knit, yarn over, knit into that stitch. So I actually increased 4 stitches on this row, and then I work my border. On my wrong side row, I work my border. I slip the marker, I make 1 yarn over, and then I purl all the way across to the stitch marker. And then when I get to the stitch marker, I work a yarn over, slip my marker, and then work my final border, knit 3. Those are the 2 rows you repeat over and over again. To end this shawl, on your last wrong side row, don't work any increases, because you don't really want to bind off a yarn over, I don't think. And that is how you do the crescent shawl. So I'm going to finish this off, and then we'll see what it looks like. So with the second crescent shawl, you can see here is the one body stitch I picked up, and then by working yarn overs right next to it, I give a continuous edge here as opposed to having the interrupted edge right here. A very talented teacher named Suzanne Bryan, I think, is the one who came up with this clever hack of the crescent shawl. I put a little picot edge on this bind off this time just for fun, but you can see straight across rather than having that big gap in the middle. And also, this one bumps up a little bit and this one really doesn't. I hope you have some great ideas now and are excited to start a garter tab shawl. This basic technique would work for other shapes as well. You just need to try to replicate as much as possible the increases from the very beginning of the shawl. And I should mention also, here's where we twisted this purl just to make it look a little bit more. That's why you purled through the back loop. Thanks again to KDO Studio for providing the platform. If you'd like to see more about me or my work, you can find me on social media. I hope to see you next year live at KDO, and in the meantime, wishing health to you and yours.